People rarely regret the fortune they never inherited, but they often spend a lifetime regretting the love they failed to recognize until it was too late. My name is Harold Whitmore, and I am 78 years old. If you had walked into my son's beautiful house during one of our Sunday family dinners, you probably would have assumed I was simply another quiet old man waiting politely for dessert. I sat in the same chair every week, smiled when someone happened to notice me, and listened far more than I spoke. No one ever asked what I had accomplished before retirement. No one seemed interested in the stories hidden behind the wrinkles on my hands or the faded watch I wore every single day. That was all right. Life had taught me long ago that people often become so busy building their future that they stop seeing the people who built theirs. My son, Michael, had become a successful real estate developer outside Lexington, Kentucky. He had worked hard, and I had always been proud of him. His wife, Jennifer, loved beautiful homes, expensive vacations, and elegant dinner parties where everything looked perfect from the outside. Their friends admired the size of their house, the luxury cars in the driveway, and the carefully landscaped yard. Every Sunday they invited family over, and every Sunday I drove my old pickup truck 25 miles to spend a few precious hours with the people I loved most. I never expected special treatment. Growing older teaches you that time together matters more than comfort. Still, there was a quiet loneliness that settled into my heart more often than I cared to admit. Conversations flowed around investment opportunities, luxury neighborhoods, business partnerships, and vacation plans that sounded more like magazine advertisements than real life. Whenever I tried to add something, the discussion usually moved on before anyone truly heard me. Sometimes Michael would glance at his phone while I was speaking. Jennifer would politely smile before changing the subject. Their friends often assumed I was simply enjoying the company, never realizing I had slowly become invisible inside my own family. I never blamed them entirely. Life moves quickly, and success has a strange way of convincing people that only the future deserves attention. But every Sunday, before leaving my small farmhouse, I carried the same worn leather notebook inside the pocket of my brown jacket. No one had ever asked what it contained, and I never volunteered the answer. Inside those pages were handwritten memories, names, dates, promises, and decisions that had quietly shaped far more lives than anyone sitting around that expensive dining table could possibly imagine. Along with the notebook, I always kept a small brass key tucked safely inside my wallet. To everyone else it looked ordinary, almost forgotten. To me it represented a promise I had made decades earlier, one I intended to keep until my very last day. As I parked my truck outside Michael's beautiful home one crisp autumn afternoon, I noticed laughter drifting through the open front door before I even stepped inside. I smiled, straightened my jacket, slipped the notebook a little deeper into my pocket, and reminded myself that sometimes the greatest acts of love happen without applause. What I did not know was that before another Sunday arrived, the family who barely noticed the old man in the corner would discover that everything they believed about my life had been completely wrong. That Sunday unfolded much like every other Sunday had for the past several years, and perhaps that was why none of them noticed how predictable my place in the family had become. I arrived 15 minutes early because I had always believed it was polite to help before guests filled the house. Jennifer greeted me warmly enough, but her eyes remained fixed on the caterer arranging trays in the kitchen. She thanked me for coming, handed me my usual glass of iced tea, and gently suggested that I relax in the sunroom until everyone else arrived. I smiled and did exactly that. From my chair I could hear laughter spilling from the kitchen as expensive wine bottles were uncorked and conversations turned toward business deals, new construction projects, and vacation homes along the Florida coast. Michael moved comfortably from one guest to another, shaking hands, exchanging compliments, and discussing opportunities that seemed larger every month. Watching him succeed still filled me with quiet pride. I had never wanted his life to resemble mine. I had always hoped it would be easier. What I had never imagined was that somewhere along the way, success would slowly replace simple appreciation. When dinner was finally served, everyone gathered around the long dining table while I quietly took the seat nearest the end. No one assigned me that place. It had simply become understood over time. The conversation flowed quickly. Jennifer admired a friend's newly renovated lake house. Another guest described purchasing a luxury sports car. Someone asked Michael about his latest commercial development, and the room filled with admiration as he spoke confidently about profits and future plans. At one point I mentioned remembering when that same piece of land had once been a family-owned apple orchard where local children picked fruit every autumn. For just a second the table grew quiet before someone politely smiled and steered the conversation back toward rising property values. My story disappeared as though it had never been spoken. I lowered my eyes and continued eating. After dessert I carried several empty dishes toward the kitchen without being asked. While rinsing plates beneath the warm water, I overheard Jennifer speaking softly to one of her friends in the adjoining room. She was not cruel, only careless in the way people sometimes become when they assume someone cannot hear them. She laughed gently and said Harold always liked feeling useful because he did not really have much else going on anymore. Her friend nodded sympathetically and replied that getting old must be difficult when life had become so ordinary. I stood perfectly still with my hands beneath the running water. Neither woman intended to wound me, but their words settled heavily inside my heart because they reflected what everyone seemed to believe. To them I was simply an aging widower with modest savings, an old pickup truck, and too much free time. No one asked why I still lived alone in the farmhouse or why I never seemed interested in selling it despite receiving generous offers over the years. No one wondered why I guarded that worn leather notebook so carefully every Sunday. As the evening came to an end, I slipped my jacket over my shoulders and reached into my pocket to make certain the little brass key was still there. My fingers closed around it with familiar comfort, and for just a moment I looked toward the hallway where an old family photograph hung on the wall. A quiet smile crossed my face because I knew something they did not. The day would come when that forgotten key would unlock far more than a simple door, and when it finally did, every person sitting around that table would see the old man they believed had nothing left to offer in a completely different light. The following Thursday morning began like hundreds of ordinary mornings before it. I woke before sunrise, brewed a pot of coffee, and carried my favorite mug onto the front porch of the old farmhouse where I had lived for more than 40 years. The fields surrounding the property shimmered beneath a blanket of light autumn fog, and for a while the world felt wonderfully quiet. I opened the worn leather notebook and slowly added another page beneath the date. I had kept that habit ever since my wife passed away 12 years earlier. She used to say that memories disappear only when nobody takes the time to preserve them. Every page contained something worth remembering, not because it involved money or success, but because it reminded me why our family existed in the first place. I wrote about Michael's first bicycle, his high school graduation, the day he bought his first house, and even the mistakes that eventually taught him valuable lessons. I never wrote with bitterness. I wrote with hope that one day someone would understand. Around mid-morning an unfamiliar sedan turned into my gravel driveway. I recognized the driver almost immediately. It was Samuel Brooks, the attorney who had handled my family's legal affairs for nearly 3 decades. He climbed out carrying a slim leather briefcase and greeted me with the same respectful smile he always had. We sat together on the porch while he reviewed several documents that required my signature. He carefully confirmed that every instruction remained exactly as I had requested years earlier. Nothing had changed. The property, the savings, the private trust, the safety deposit box, and one sealed package were all still protected exactly as planned. Samuel paused before placing one final envelope on the table between us. He reminded me that I could change my mind at any time. I simply smiled and shook my head. Some promises become more important with age, not less. Before leaving, he looked at me for a long moment and quietly said that he hoped my family would someday understand why I had made these decisions. I watched his car disappear down the country road before carrying the envelope back inside the house. Instead of opening it, I locked it inside the old oak cabinet in my study using the small brass key that never left my wallet. That key fit only one drawer, and inside that drawer rested far more than legal papers. There were photographs, handwritten letters, receipts dating back decades, and evidence of choices that had quietly shaped my family's future without anyone ever realizing it. That evening Michael called to ask whether I planned to come for dinner again the following Sunday. His voice sounded distracted as he spoke about another busy week at work, but I gladly accepted the invitation without hesitation. Before hanging up, he casually mentioned that Jennifer's parents and several business associates would also be attending. I wished him a good evening and set the phone down gently. Then I looked once more toward the locked cabinet across the room. For reasons I could not fully explain, I suddenly felt that the years of silence surrounding its contents were beginning to draw quietly toward their end. Sunday arrived beneath a bright Kentucky sky, and I found myself following the same familiar road toward Michael's house with an unusual feeling that I could not quite explain. The leather notebook rested inside my jacket pocket as always, while the small brass key remained tucked safely inside my wallet. During the drive I remembered something my late wife used to tell me whenever life became uncertain. She believed that truth had its own calendar and that no amount of silence could postpone the day it finally stepped into the light. By the time I reached the house, luxury vehicles already filled the driveway. Jennifer's parents had arrived early along with several respected business partners whose conversations revolved around investments, expanding companies, and retirement portfolios. I quietly parked my aging pickup truck at the end of the street where there was still room and walked the remaining distance with the dessert Jennifer had asked me to bring. She thanked me politely before carrying it into the kitchen without opening the container. A few moments later I found my usual seat near the end of the living room while everyone else gathered around the fireplace discussing markets, private schools, and vacation properties. No one intentionally excluded me, yet somehow every conversation continued flowing naturally around me instead of toward me. I simply listened, smiled whenever someone happened to include me, and reminded myself that bitterness had never solved loneliness. During dinner Jennifer's father proudly announced that Michael's newest commercial development had attracted several influential investors. Everyone applauded the achievement. I joined them with genuine pride because my son's success had always mattered more to me than my own recognition. After the meal, the family moved into the backyard where coffee was served beneath strings of decorative lights. Michael became busy showing his guests architectural drawings for another upcoming project. I wandered quietly through the garden until my youngest granddaughter, Lily, who had just turned 9, walked over carrying a glass of lemonade. Unlike the adults, children often notice what others overlook. She looked up at me with curious eyes and asked why I always carried the same old notebook. I smiled and told her it contained important memories that I hoped would never be forgotten. She asked if she could see it someday. Before I could answer, Jennifer gently called her back inside to help prepare dessert. Lily waved before running toward the house, leaving me alone beneath the maple tree. I slipped the notebook from my pocket for just a moment and rested it on the garden table beside me. As I opened it, an old photograph partially slid from between the pages. It showed Michael as a little boy sitting on the shoulders of a younger version of myself outside this very farmhouse many years earlier. Folded behind the photograph rested a yellow document bearing several signatures and an official county seal. Before I could return everything to its place, I noticed someone standing silently on the back porch watching me from a distance. It was Jennifer's father. His eyes lingered not on the photograph but on the document itself, and the expression that crossed his face suggested he recognized something he had not expected to see. He quickly looked away before I could speak, but in that brief moment I realized the first person had finally begun to remember a chapter of the past that everyone else had completely forgotten. The image of Jennifer's father staring at that old document remained with me long after I returned home that evening. There had been something unmistakable in his expression. It was not simple curiosity. It was recognition mixed with uncertainty, as though a forgotten memory had suddenly resurfaced without revealing its entire story. I did not mention it to anyone because experience had taught me that truth reveals itself more naturally when it is not forced. During the following week I settled back into my familiar routine at the farmhouse. The mornings were filled with tending the vegetable garden, repairing an old wooden fence, and writing another page in the leather notebook that had become my closest companion. Every evening I reread one or two earlier entries, remembering moments that time had quietly hidden from everyone except me. On Friday afternoon the telephone rang. It was Samuel Brooks again. His calm voice carried a seriousness that immediately caught my attention. He asked whether he could stop by the following morning because he had located one additional item while reviewing my family's legal records. He explained that it had been stored separately for many years according to very specific instructions left by my late wife. The next morning he arrived, carrying a small weathered wooden box no larger than a family Bible. The polished oak surface had darkened with age, and a tiny brass lock rested on the front. Before handing it to me, Samuel quietly said that he had never opened it and legally could not do so. My wife had instructed that only I could unlock it using the brass key I had carried for decades. For several long moments I simply held the box without speaking. My hands trembled slightly because I recognized the craftsmanship immediately. I had built that little box myself during our first year of marriage. I had completely forgotten it existed. Samuel wished me well and quietly departed, leaving me alone with memories that suddenly felt very close again. After his car disappeared down the driveway, I carried the box into my study, locked the front door, and sat beside the old oak cabinet. Slowly I removed the brass key from my wallet and turned it inside the tiny lock. The lid opened with surprising ease despite the passing years. Inside rested several carefully preserved items wrapped in soft linen cloth. The first was my wife's wedding ring, which she had asked me to keep safe after illness had made it too uncomfortable for her to wear. Beside it lay a bundle of photographs tied together with faded blue ribbon. There were pictures of Michael as a smiling little boy, our first farmhouse Christmas, family picnics beneath the maple tree, and one photograph of my wife standing proudly beside an unfamiliar man outside a small brick office building. Beneath the photographs rested a sealed envelope with my name written in her unmistakable handwriting. I stared at it for several minutes without breaking the seal. Somehow I already knew that once I read those words, the quiet promise we had protected together for so many years would begin moving toward the moment neither of us had ever been able to witness, and I sensed with complete certainty that the answers my family had spent decades unknowingly searching for were waiting inside that envelope. For nearly an hour I sat in complete silence with the unopened envelope resting gently between my hands. The handwriting on the front belonged to my wife, Eleanor, as unmistakable as the day she had first written my name inside the cover of our family Bible more than 50 years earlier. I finally broke the seal with trembling fingers and unfolded the carefully preserved pages. Her words carried the warmth that had always filled our home. She wrote that if I was reading the letter, then enough years had passed for our family to face a truth that we had deliberately chosen to protect. She reminded me that genuine love never demanded recognition and that some sacrifices only revealed their purpose after time had softened pride into wisdom. She asked me not to become bitter if people forgot where their blessings began because gratitude often arrives long after success. As I continued reading, memories that had rested quietly inside my heart returned with remarkable clarity. More than 30 years earlier, Michael had been preparing to leave for college while money was painfully scarce. At the very same time, another family in town faced financial disaster after a promising business collapsed under unexpected debt. Eleanor and I had quietly made a decision that changed far more lives than anyone realized. Without telling a single person, we sold a valuable piece of farmland that had belonged to my parents for generations. Part of the money ensured Michael could continue his education without interruption. The remaining funds were placed into a confidential investment that allowed another struggling family to keep their small company alive. Eleanor insisted that no one should ever know because kindness loses something precious the moment it begins asking for applause. She ended that section of the letter by writing that if the truth ever became necessary, I would already know exactly when the right moment had arrived. Beneath the letter rested another folded document. It contained signatures, banking records, and legal agreements connecting events that had seemed completely unrelated for decades. I immediately recognized one of the names on those papers. It belonged to Jennifer's father many years before he became wealthy and respected throughout the community. Suddenly his strange expression when he noticed the document in the garden made perfect sense. Somewhere deep inside his memory he had recognized the paperwork without fully understanding why. My eyes slowly drifted toward the old photograph lying beside the letter. Eleanor stood smiling beside that modest brick office building with Jennifer's father, who looked almost unrecognizable as a young businessman standing at the uncertain beginning of his career. On the back of the photograph, Eleanor had written a single sentence in blue ink. "Someday this family will discover that the greatest inheritance is not the money we leave behind but the compassion that made it possible." I carefully returned every item to the wooden box except the letter, which I folded and placed inside my leather notebook. As evening settled across the farmhouse, I stood beside the front window watching the sun disappear behind the fields. For the first time in many years I sensed that the quiet promise Eleanor and I had faithfully guarded was no longer approaching from a distant future. It was already beginning to unfold, and before many more Sundays had passed, every member of my family would finally understand why an ordinary old man had spent decades protecting a simple brass key, a weathered notebook, and a secret that had quietly shaped all of their lives. The following Sunday carried an unusual sense of quiet anticipation that I could not explain. Before leaving the farmhouse, I slipped Eleanor's letter into the leather notebook and carefully locked the wooden box back inside the oak cabinet. The brass key returned to its familiar place inside my wallet, where it had rested for more than 3 decades. During the drive I found myself thinking less about the secrets of the past and more about the people gathered around my son's table. I did not want anyone to feel ashamed when the truth eventually came to light. Eleanor and I had never sacrificed for recognition. We had sacrificed because love had seemed like the only choice worth making. When I arrived, the house was already alive with conversation. Michael greeted me with a quick embrace before excusing himself to answer a business call. Jennifer smiled warmly and thanked me for coming, but she too was pulled away by guests arriving through the front door. I quietly placed my homemade apple pie on the kitchen counter and walked outside into the backyard where the crisp autumn air felt calmer than the crowded rooms inside. A few minutes later, Jennifer's father, Richard Collins, stepped onto the patio carrying 2 cups of coffee. Without saying much, he handed one to me and stood beside the wooden fence overlooking the trees. For several moments neither of us spoke. Finally he glanced toward me and asked if we had ever met before Michael and Jennifer were married. The question surprised me only because I had been expecting it ever since I saw the expression on his face the previous Sunday. I smiled gently and answered that life sometimes brought people together long before they realized it. Richard studied me carefully before admitting that an old photograph had been troubling him all week. He could not remember where he had seen my face, yet something about that document and the picture refused to leave his mind. I simply nodded and told him that memories often returned when they were ready, not when we demanded them. Before he could ask another question, Lily came running across the lawn with a bright smile. She carried a small drawing she had made of our family sitting around the dinner table. Every person was smiling, including me. She proudly pointed to my figure and said she had placed me at the center because grandfathers always kept families together. Her innocent words filled the silence more powerfully than anything the adults had said all afternoon. Richard looked down at the drawing for a long time before quietly thanking Lily. I noticed something changing in his expression. The confidence that usually surrounded him had softened into thoughtful reflection. As dinner came to an end and guests prepared to leave, Richard approached me once more. This time his voice carried genuine humility. He asked whether I would allow him to visit the farmhouse sometime during the coming week because there were questions about his past that he suddenly felt compelled to answer. Looking into his eyes, I realized the first door had finally begun to open. Whatever had remained hidden for more than 30 years was no longer waiting in silence. The truth had already begun finding its way back to the people whose lives it had quietly shaped from the very beginning. 3 days later, Richard arrived at my farmhouse precisely as he had promised. He came alone, driving a modest sedan instead of one of the luxury vehicles I had often seen him use. When I opened the front door, I noticed something different about him. The confidence of a successful businessman was still there, but it had been replaced by the quiet humility of a man searching for answers rather than offering them. We sat together on the porch overlooking the fields where the afternoon breeze gently stirred the tall grass. For several minutes Richard admired the peaceful landscape before finally speaking. He confessed that ever since seeing the old photograph and legal document, memories he had buried decades earlier had begun returning one by one. He remembered owning a small construction company during the early years of his marriage. One unexpected financial setback had nearly forced him to close the business forever. Banks had refused additional loans, suppliers had stopped extending credit, and he had been preparing to tell his young family that everything they had built was about to disappear. Then, almost without explanation, an anonymous investment arrived through an attorney. The money gave him enough time to save the company. He had spent years trying to discover who had helped him, but every legal document protected the identity of the benefactors. Richard looked directly at me and quietly admitted that when he saw the county records in my notebook, he realized the dates matched perfectly. I listened without interrupting. When he finally asked whether Eleanor and I had been responsible, I reached into my leather notebook and carefully removed the old photograph. I placed it beside his coffee cup without saying a word. His eyes immediately filled with recognition. He remembered the day the picture had been taken outside his first office after the investment had secured the company's future. Eleanor had insisted on taking a photograph simply because she believed every fresh beginning deserved to be remembered. Richard lowered his head and remained silent for several moments. He confessed that he had spent more than 30 years thanking good fortune for saving his business, never imagining that ordinary neighbors had quietly changed the course of his family's future. I gently explained that Eleanor and I had never considered ourselves extraordinary. We had simply believed that if God had given us enough to help another family survive, then keeping that blessing to ourselves would have been the greater loss. Richard's voice trembled as he apologized for every Sunday he had walked past me believing I was simply an elderly man with an unremarkable life. I smiled and told him there was nothing to forgive because he had judged me using the same limited information everyone else possessed. Before leaving, Richard asked one final question. He wanted to know whether Michael understood any part of this story. I quietly shook my head. Neither Michael nor Jennifer knew that our families had been connected long before they ever met. Richard stood slowly, looked once more across the peaceful farmland, and said that the truth could no longer remain hidden. He believed his daughter, my son, and everyone who had unknowingly benefited from Eleanor's kindness deserved to hear the entire story. As his car disappeared down the gravel road, I looked toward the oak cabinet inside the farmhouse where the wooden box still rested safely behind its locked door. For the first time since Eleanor had written that letter, I realized the moment she had been waiting for all those years had finally arrived, and there would be no turning back once the truth was spoken aloud. That Saturday evening Michael called to invite me to another family dinner the following day. His voice sounded cheerful, completely unaware that the quiet foundation beneath so many years of assumptions was about to shift forever. He explained that Jennifer wanted both families together because Richard had something important he wished to discuss. I accepted the invitation without asking any questions. After the call ended, I stood for several minutes beside the old oak cabinet before unlocking it one more time. I removed the wooden box, the legal documents, Eleanor's letter, and the collection of photographs. Everything was carefully placed inside a weathered leather briefcase that had belonged to my father. Before closing it, I paused to look at Eleanor's smiling face in the oldest photograph. She always believed that truth should arrive gently whenever possible. I quietly promised that I would honor her wish. The next afternoon the Whitmore home was unusually calm. Even the ordinary conversation seemed softer than usual, as though everyone sensed an important moment approaching. Jennifer greeted me warmly, and for the first time in many years she offered to carry my briefcase inside without knowing what it contained. Richard arrived shortly afterward. Unlike previous gatherings, he did not immediately begin discussing business or current events. Instead, he remained thoughtful throughout the meal, speaking only when necessary. After dessert had been served, he slowly stood from his chair and asked whether everyone would allow him a few minutes to share something deeply personal. The room became completely quiet. Michael looked surprised, while Jennifer reached gently for her father's hand. Richard took a slow breath before explaining that many years earlier his company had nearly collapsed. He described the overwhelming debts, the fear of losing everything, and the anonymous financial rescue that had arrived just when all hope seemed gone. He admitted that he had spent decades believing remarkable luck had changed his life until a recent visit to my farmhouse forced him to question everything he thought he knew. Then he turned toward me with eyes filled not with embarrassment but with gratitude. He thanked me publicly before anyone understood why. Michael looked at me in complete confusion. Jennifer glanced back and forth between her father and me, searching for an explanation that had not yet come. Richard quietly told them that the anonymous family who had sacrificed valuable land to save his business had been sitting at their dinner table every Sunday for years. Silence settled across the room so completely that even the ticking clock on the wall suddenly seemed loud. Michael slowly shook his head, insisting there had to be some mistake because he had never heard such a story before. I calmly placed the old leather briefcase on the dining table and opened it. One by one I laid out the faded photographs, county records, investment agreements, and finally Eleanor's handwritten letter. Nobody reached toward the papers. Nobody spoke. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the quiet evidence resting before them. Then Lily, with the innocent honesty only a child possesses, looked up at her father and softly asked why Grandpa had never told anyone that he had helped another family. No adult answered her question because in that unforgettable moment everyone realized the greatest story in our family had never been hidden by secrets alone. It had also been hidden by the simple assumption that an ordinary old man could never have accomplished something extraordinary. For what felt like a very long time, nobody around the dining table spoke. Michael slowly picked up the first photograph with careful hands, studying the younger faces of Eleanor and me standing beside Richard outside the small office building. He then reached for the legal documents, reading each page with increasing disbelief. Jennifer quietly unfolded Eleanor's handwritten letter, and as her eyes moved across the words, tears gathered without warning. She stopped reading halfway through and gently passed the letter to Michael, unable to continue. He read every sentence in complete silence. By the time he reached the final page, the confident businessman who usually solved every problem with certainty seemed to have disappeared. He looked at me as though he were seeing his own father for the very first time. His voice was barely above a whisper when he finally asked why I had never told him about selling Grandpa's farmland to pay for his education and to rescue another struggling family. I smiled gently because it was the simplest question in the room. I explained that Eleanor and I had always believed generosity stopped being pure the moment it expected gratitude in return. We never wanted Michael to feel burdened by sacrifice. We wanted him to build his future believing he had every opportunity to succeed on his own. Richard quietly added that the anonymous investment had not only saved his company but had eventually created the business that supported Jennifer's education, their family home, and countless employees over the following decades. He admitted that every achievement he proudly celebrated had unknowingly rested upon a kindness he had never been able to thank. Jennifer slowly walked around the table and knelt beside my chair. With tears still in her eyes, she apologized for every careless comment she had made over the years. She admitted that she had mistaken quietness for weakness and simplicity for failure. I gently placed my hand over hers and assured her that resentment had never found a place inside my heart. Everyone makes judgments with incomplete information at some point in life. What mattered was what they chose to do after discovering the truth. Lily quietly climbed onto my lap and wrapped her arms around my shoulders without saying a single word. Somehow the child understood what the adults were still struggling to accept. Michael finally stood and crossed the room until he was standing directly in front of me. His eyes filled with regret as he admitted that he had spent years chasing success without ever asking how his own journey had truly begun. He confessed that he had been so focused on building a larger future that he had slowly stopped looking back at the people who made that future possible. I told him that every parent hopes to see their child move farther than they ever could, but no success is complete if gratitude gets left behind along the way. Before anyone spoke again, Richard quietly reached into his briefcase and removed another envelope. He explained that after leaving my farmhouse several days earlier, he had instructed his attorney to prepare something that he believed should have happened many years ago. As he carefully slid the sealed envelope across the table toward me, every person in the room realized that the story Eleanor and I had quietly written through decades of sacrifice was about to change the future of our family one final time. Richard waited until every eye was fixed upon the sealed envelope before quietly breaking the silence. He explained that during the days following his visit to my farmhouse, he had reviewed decades of financial records with his attorney and discovered that no amount of gratitude could ever truly repay what Eleanor and I had done for his family. Even so, he believed gratitude demanded action, not merely words. He carefully opened the envelope and removed several neatly organized documents. They were not gifts born from obligation but decisions made after thoughtful reflection. Richard announced that he had established an educational foundation in Eleanor's name to provide scholarships for hard-working students from farming families throughout our county, ensuring that young people with limited financial resources would never have to abandon their dreams because of circumstances beyond their control. He then explained that the first contribution to the foundation came from his own family, while every future donation would honor the quiet couple whose sacrifice had made his success possible. The room remained completely silent as everyone absorbed the meaning behind his words. I felt a deep sense of peace because Eleanor had always believed that the greatest kindness was the one that inspired another act of kindness long after the original gift had been forgotten. Richard then turned toward Michael and Jennifer and admitted that he carried another burden upon his heart. He confessed that for years he had admired success more than character, often encouraging those around him to measure people by visible accomplishments instead of quiet integrity. He apologized to his daughter for unknowingly teaching lessons that had made her overlook the extraordinary value of an ordinary life. Jennifer lowered her eyes, unable to hide her regret. Michael stepped closer to me and quietly admitted that somewhere along the way he had become more interested in expanding buildings than strengthening relationships. He realized that while he had proudly built a successful business, he had unintentionally allowed distance to grow between himself and the father who had quietly built the foundation beneath his entire future. I placed my hand on his shoulder and reminded him that life always offers another opportunity to become the person we wish we had been yesterday. Lily suddenly asked whether great-grandma Eleanor would be happy if she could see everyone together now. Her innocent question brought gentle smiles through tearful eyes. I answered that Eleanor would not care about the apologies or the documents nearly as much as she would care about what happened after everyone left the table. Forgiveness is meaningful only when it changes tomorrow instead of simply explaining yesterday. Samuel Brooks, who had quietly joined the gathering at Richard's invitation, then spoke for the first time that afternoon. He explained that Eleanor had anticipated this very conversation many years earlier. Before her passing, she had instructed him to release one final legal document only after every member of the family understood the true purpose behind her sacrifices. Samuel slowly reached into his leather briefcase and withdrew a long sealed envelope bearing Eleanor's unmistakable signature. He gently placed it beside the remaining papers and looked directly at me before saying that this final instruction had remained untouched for more than 3 decades. As every person around the table stared at Eleanor's final sealed message, I realized that everything revealed so far had only prepared our family for the last gift she had quietly planned before saying goodbye. Samuel carefully broke the aging wax seal and unfolded the final document with the same respect he had shown every one of Eleanor's wishes throughout the years. The room remained completely still as he began reading her words aloud. Eleanor wrote that if her family was hearing this message, then they had finally discovered that the greatest wealth was never measured by land, businesses, or bank accounts. She reminded every person around the table that money could build comfortable houses, but only kindness could build lasting homes. She thanked Samuel for protecting her final request and explained that she wanted no statues, no buildings carrying her name, and no recognition beyond one simple promise. She asked every member of the family to become the answer to someone else's quiet prayer at least once each year without revealing their identity. She believed that anonymous generosity allowed love to continue traveling from one generation to the next without expecting applause. As Samuel finished reading, silence filled the room once again, but this time it felt peaceful instead of uncertain. Michael slowly folded the letter and looked toward me with eyes that carried both sorrow and hope. He admitted that he had spent years believing success meant collecting more than the previous year. Now he realized that his parents had measured success by how much they quietly gave away. Jennifer gently reached across the table and took Richard's hand before taking mine with her other hand. She promised that Eleanor's words would not end with this afternoon. Richard quietly announced that the Educational Foundation would begin accepting applications before the end of the year and that every scholarship recipient would receive a copy of Eleanor's final letter so they would understand that their opportunity existed because ordinary people had once chosen compassion over comfort. Lily smiled brightly and declared that when she grew older, she wanted to help people without telling anyone because great-grandma Eleanor had shown her that secrets could sometimes be beautiful when they protected kindness instead of pride. Her innocent words drew warm laughter from everyone around the table. Samuel then gathered the legal papers and calmly informed us that his final responsibility had now been fulfilled. Every trust had been completed exactly as Eleanor and I intended, every document had been delivered, and every promise made decades earlier had finally reached its proper conclusion. As the evening sunlight streamed gently through the dining room windows, Michael quietly moved his chair beside mine instead of across the table. He asked whether we could begin having Sunday dinners at the farmhouse from now on, not because it was convenient but because he wanted Lily to grow up understanding where her family's story truly began. I accepted with a grateful smile. Several weeks later, our first gathering at the farmhouse felt entirely different from every dinner that had come before. There were no conversations about status or accomplishments. Instead, there were shared recipes, old photographs, laughter echoing across the porch, and Lily running through the fields where Eleanor and I had once dreamed about the future together. Before everyone left that evening, Michael paused beside the old oak cabinet and quietly thanked it for guarding a story that had patiently waited for the right moment to change every heart in the room. As I watched my family drive away beneath the golden Kentucky sunset, I realized Eleanor's greatest gift had never been the land we sold, the money we sacrificed, or the secrets we protected. Her greatest gift was that she transformed a family that once overlooked an ordinary old man into one that would never again mistake quiet love for an ordinary life. Over the months that followed, our Sundays quietly became the part of the week everyone anticipated most. The old farmhouse no longer echoed with memories alone. It welcomed fresh laughter, shared meals, and conversations that stretched long after the sun disappeared behind the Kentucky hills. Michael often arrived early to help repair weathered fences or tend the vegetable garden that Eleanor had loved for so many years. Jennifer brought family recipes she had collected from both sides of the family, carefully writing Eleanor's name beside every dish that had once been prepared in this very kitchen. Richard visited often as well, never allowing another month to pass without updating us on the scholarship foundation. The first group of students had already been selected, each one coming from hard-working families whose dreams had been threatened by financial hardship. None of them knew every detail of Eleanor's story, but every one of them understood that a stranger's quiet kindness had opened a door they never expected to walk through. Samuel Brooks retired not long afterward. Before leaving his office for the final time, he handed me the original trust documents in a simple wooden folder and smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had faithfully completed a promise lasting more than 3 decades. He told me that very few attorneys were fortunate enough to witness legal papers accomplish exactly what they had been written to do, not merely transfer property but restore relationships. I placed the folder inside the oak cabinet, locked it with the familiar brass key, and quietly realized that the cabinet no longer protected secrets. It protected a legacy. One cool autumn afternoon, Lily asked whether she could keep the old leather notebook someday. I told her that the notebook was never valuable because of the leather, the pages, or the photographs tucked inside. Its value came from the stories it preserved and the lessons each generation chose to continue writing. She smiled and promised that if it ever became hers, she would fill the remaining empty pages with stories about people who helped others without expecting anything in return. Looking into her bright young eyes, I saw the same quiet determination that had once lived inside Eleanor. As the seasons continued changing, I noticed something even more meaningful than the restored warmth within our family. Michael began setting aside time each week for his employees instead of rushing from one meeting to another. Jennifer quietly organized community food drives without placing her name on promotional materials. Richard personally mentored young business owners facing the same fears he had once carried. None of them announced these changes. They simply lived differently. One peaceful evening, I stood alone on the farmhouse porch watching the last light fade across the fields where Eleanor and I had walked together countless times. The brass key rested comfortably in my pocket, but for the first time in many years I understood that I no longer needed to guard anything hidden behind a locked door. The greatest inheritance had already found its rightful home inside the hearts of the people I loved. If someone were to ask what my final gift to my family had truly been, I would tell them it was never the farmland, the legal papers, the trust, or even the long-protected secret. My greatest gift was helping them discover that the quietest acts of love often leave the deepest marks upon future generations, and that an ordinary life lived with extraordinary kindness can continue changing the world long after the person who lived it has quietly gone home. Nearly 1 year passed before I fully understood how far a single quiet decision could travel through the lives of people I might never meet. The farmhouse remained much the same as it had always been. The porch still creaked beneath familiar footsteps, the oak tree still stretched across the front yard, and the old pickup truck still carried me into town whenever I needed supplies. Yet everything around those ordinary things felt different because my family no longer came out of obligation. They came because the farmhouse had become the place where they remembered who they truly wanted to be. One bright spring morning, Richard invited all of us to attend the first gathering of students who had received scholarships through Eleanor's foundation. The ceremony was held inside a modest community center only a few miles from the courthouse where so many of our family documents had quietly waited through the years. There were no grand decorations or expensive displays. Instead, there were hopeful young faces, grateful parents, and teachers who believed deeply in the futures sitting before them. Richard stood at the podium only briefly before inviting me to say a few words. I slowly walked to the front of the room carrying nothing except Eleanor's old leather notebook. I explained that every page inside had been filled by ordinary days rather than extraordinary moments. It contained grocery lists beside family memories, reminders about repairing fences beside dreams for Michael's future. I told the students that a meaningful life is rarely built through one dramatic decision. It is built through thousands of quiet choices that nobody applauds while they are happening. I encouraged them to remember that success becomes truly valuable only after it creates opportunities for someone else. When I finished speaking, one young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. She explained that without the scholarship she would have needed to leave college and return home because her family simply could not afford another semester. She thanked me for changing her future. I gently smiled and told her that the thanks belonged to a woman named Eleanor who believed that hope should always travel farther than the person who first carried it. As we drove back to the farmhouse that afternoon, Lily sat beside me holding the notebook on her lap. She carefully asked whether she could write the young woman's story on one of the remaining blank pages. I nodded and handed her my fountain pen. She slowly wrote that kindness never truly ends because every grateful heart eventually becomes another generous hand. Her simple sentence made everyone in the truck quietly smile. That evening our family gathered once more on the old porch as the Kentucky sunset painted the fields with warm golden light. Michael looked across the land that had once been sacrificed for his future and softly admitted that he finally understood why Eleanor had never regretted letting it go. Some things become far more valuable after they are given away. I looked toward the horizon where the last rays of daylight gently disappeared and realized that the greatest stories are not remembered because they begin with remarkable people. They are remembered because ordinary people choose remarkable kindness again and again until future generations forget their names but never forget the love they left behind.